My daughter-in-law reached across the table, took the gift out of my hands, and said, "That's not yours." It was Christmas Eve. The room was warm. The tree lights were on. Plates were still half full. And suddenly, no one breathed. I remember how quiet it got. Not the peaceful kind. The kind where you can hear your own pulse in your ears. I looked at her, waiting for the laugh, the correction, the moment where she'd say she was joking. She didn't. She held the box like it had always belonged to her. Her fingers were steady. Confident. Like this was a correction she'd been waiting to make. I turned to my son. I needed him to say something. Anything. A word. A question. A simple, "That's not true." He didn't look at me. He stared at the floor, his jaw tight, his hands clasped together like he was bracing for impact. That hurt more than her words. Because silence is a decision, whether people admit it or not. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted in their chair. I felt myself shrinking, not because I was weak, but because I was being erased in real time. She smiled then. Not warm. Not cruel. Certain. She said things I hadn't agreed to. Things I'd never said. She spoke like arrangements had already been made. Like timelines were already set. Like my role in my own life had expired, and I was the last one to notice. I wanted to argue. I wanted to grab the box back. I wanted to demand explanations. But something stopped me. It was the way she spoke about my things. My home. My choices. Not as possibilities. As conclusions. That was when I understood this wasn't a family disagreement. It was a transfer of power. And as I sat there, watching everyone avoid my eyes, I made a quiet promise to myself. I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't beg to be respected. I would let the truth speak for me. And when it did, it wouldn't be gentle. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. Before that Christmas Eve, my life was quiet in a way I'd earned. My name is Portia Whitcomb. I lived in Atlanta, Georgia, in the same house my husband Solomon Whitcomb and I had bought decades earlier. It wasn't grand, but it was solid. Sunlight came through the front windows every morning, and the floors still creaked in the places we'd learned to step around together. After Solomon passed, the house didn't feel empty. It felt full of him. The jewelry stayed in the cedar box in my bedroom dresser. Most of it stayed there, untouched. I only ever took it out when I needed to remind myself what it meant. Solomon had shown it to me years ago, explaining where it came from, who wore it, and why it mattered. 3 generations before me. Care passed down, not claimed. He trusted me with that choice. When? To whom? Or if? That mattered more to me than the metal or stones ever could. Keenan Whitcomb visited less after he got married. Not abruptly. Gradually. Shorter calls. Missed holidays explained away with work or travel. When he did come by, he seemed distracted, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Tiana Whitcomb, on the other hand, noticed everything. She commented on furniture. Asked where things came from. Mentioned how hard it must be for me to manage on my own. Her tone was polite, almost helpful, but her eyes stayed busy. Measuring. Filing things away. I told myself I was imagining it. That this was just what it felt like to get older. To be the one people worried about. Still, when Christmas approached, I took the cedar box out and held it longer than I needed to. I wasn't ready to let go. But I believed the choice was still mine. The shift didn't happen all at once. That's what made it easy to ignore. It started with small decisions I wasn't part of. Dinner plans changed without asking me. Holidays were simplified. Conversations stopped when I walked into the room, then restarted with softer voices and careful smiles. Nothing I could point to. Nothing I could accuse. Keenan had always been steady. Not loud. Not dramatic. He used to ask my opinion about everything, work choices, money, even paint colors. After he married Tiana, those questions faded. When I offered advice, he nodded, but it didn't land the way it used to. His eyes would flick to her, just for a second, like he was checking alignment. She never interrupted me directly. She didn't have to. If I mentioned something from the past, she'd redirect the conversation forward. If I talked about plans, she'd gently reframe them. That might be a lot for you, she'd say. Or, we can handle that later. That word began to replace me. I noticed it most when she spoke about my home. She called it the house, not your house. She talked about maintenance, upkeep, resale value. Once, she asked if I had everything organized somewhere, just in case. I laughed it off. Told her I was fine. But later, alone, I stood in the hallway and looked around like I was seeing the place through someone else's eyes. Not as a life. As a list. Keenan didn't argue with her. He didn't agree either. He just stayed quiet. That silence created space, and she filled it easily. By the time Christmas invitations were sent, I already felt like a guest in my own family. I just didn't know yet how far that feeling was about to go. A few weeks before Christmas, Tiana started asking questions that didn't sound like questions. She asked about paperwork. Where I kept it. Whether it was updated. She asked if I'd ever thought about making things easier for everyone by putting things in one place. Her voice stayed light, but her timing never was. These questions always came when Keenan was in the room. If I hesitated, she stepped in smoothly. I just worry, she said once, resting a hand on my arm like we were allies. So many people wait too long. Too long for what, she never said. And every so often, she'd mention things she'd heard, from people I barely knew, about how I seemed overwhelmed lately. Keenan listened without reacting. Not defending me. Not challenging her. Just absorbing it. Later, when I brought it up, he shrugged and said she was only trying to help. That word again. Help. One afternoon, I caught her standing in my living room with her phone out, taking pictures. When I asked what she was doing, she didn't flinch. Just so we remember where everything is, she said. For later. Later felt close. Closer than it should have. I started double-checking drawers after they left. Not because anything was missing, but because I needed reassurance that what I owned still belonged to me. That I hadn't imagined the shift. At night, I replayed conversations and wondered if I'd said something wrong. If I'd promised something and forgotten. The doubt crept in quietly, the way it does when someone else speaks with certainty. But when I sat with my own thoughts, the truth stayed clear. I hadn't promised anything. Not to her. Not to anyone. Still, the way she spoke carried weight. Like groundwork being laid. Like she was building a version of events that didn't need my permission to exist. By the time Christmas week arrived, I wasn't just uneasy. I felt like I was being prepared for replacement. The week before Christmas, I took the cedar box out again. I set it on the bed and sat beside it for a long time before opening the lid. The smell of the wood was familiar, grounding. Inside, the jewelry rested exactly the way Solomon had arranged it years ago, each piece wrapped carefully, each one carrying more history than value. Solomon had been clear when he handed that box to me. Not in a dramatic way. Just practical. He said the jewelry wasn't meant to be rushed through generations like an obligation. It was meant to be passed when the person holding it felt ready. When the moment made sense. That responsibility stayed with me after he died. I picked up the necklace first. Held it against my palm. Thought about the women who wore it before me, none of them forced, none of them pressured. I thought about how easily that kind of respect could disappear if no one guarded it. I had planned to give one piece to Tiana. Not because she asked. Because I wanted to welcome her fully, on my terms. I wanted the gesture to mean something. I wrapped a small gift box carefully, the one piece tucked inside, and put the cedar box back where it belonged. For a moment, doubt crept in. Not about the gift, but about the timing. Something in my chest tightened, a quiet warning I didn't want to name. I told myself I was being cautious. That grief makes you protective. That families shift, and this was just part of it. I placed the gift under the tree and stepped back. At that point, I still believed generosity could settle unease. I still believed choosing kindness would be enough. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in noise and forced cheer. Keenan and Tiana came over in the early evening, arms full of bags, voices bright in that way people get when they're performing happiness. A few relatives followed, cousins, an aunt, people I hadn't seen since the funeral. The house filled quickly, heat rising, coats tossed over chairs. The tree lights glowed in the corner, blinking softly. Music played low. Plates moved from hand to hand. From the outside, it looked like everything it was supposed to be. Tiana moved through the room like she belonged everywhere at once. She greeted people by name, corrected small details, directed where things should go. When someone asked me a question, she answered first, smiling as if we were sharing the role. I watched Keenan drift behind her, carrying things, nodding along. He laughed when she laughed. When she spoke, he didn't interrupt. At one point, she gathered everyone closer to the tree. "Let's do gifts now," she said, clapping her hands lightly. It wasn't a suggestion. I felt that tightness again. The sense that something was being rushed. But the room was already moving, chairs shifting, people settling in. I stood near the tree, hands folded, waiting. The gift sat beneath the lowest branch, wrapped neatly, the ribbon still perfect. I hadn't planned to make a moment of it. Just a simple exchange. As I reached down to pick it up, I noticed Tiana watching me. Not with curiosity. With expectation. That should have warned me. But I was still trying to believe this was just a holiday. Just family. Just one more step forward. I didn't know yet that the moment was already decided. And that everyone else would be pulled into it with me. I lifted the gift from under the tree and held it out toward Tiana. I didn't make a speech. I didn't explain the history. I just said her name and smiled, the way you do when you're offering something personal and hoping it's received with care. That's when she stepped forward and took it out of my hands. Not gently. Not roughly either. Just decisively. "That's not yours," she said. The words didn't sound loud, but they landed hard. They cut straight through the room and settled there, heavy and final. For a second, I didn't understand what I'd heard. I actually smiled, waiting for her to laugh or correct herself. She didn't. She held the small box against her chest, like she was securing something that could be taken from her. Her face was calm. Almost relieved. The room went still. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Someone let out a short, nervous laugh that went nowhere. I could feel eyes shifting between us, searching for cues. I turned to Keenan. I needed him to step in. To say this wasn't okay. To remind her that this was my gift to give. He didn't move. He looked down at the floor, jaw tight, shoulders slightly hunched, like he was bracing himself. That silence pressed down harder than anything she'd said. Tiana continued speaking, explaining without explaining. She talked about how things had already been discussed. How it was better this way. How everyone would understand soon enough. I didn't hear every word. My ears rang. My hands felt empty in a way that went beyond the box. I stood there, surrounded by family, and realized I wasn't being challenged. I was being overruled. And she had chosen to do it where witnesses couldn't look away. No one spoke after that. Not right away. The silence stretched, awkward and exposed, like everyone was waiting for someone else to take responsibility for what had just happened. I could feel the room holding its breath, afraid that if anyone said the wrong thing, the evening would crack completely. I looked around at faces I'd known for years. People who had sat at my table, eaten my food, shared memories in this house. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked curious. A few avoided my eyes altogether. Tiana broke the silence first. She laughed lightly, as if she'd just corrected a small mistake. She said it had all been settled already. That I'd agreed to things a long time ago. That I just didn't remember the details the way I used to. The words hid in pieces. Not accusations. Implications. I felt heat rise in my chest. Not anger yet. Something colder. The kind of realization that arrives when you understand someone has been speaking for you without your consent. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Not because I didn't have words, but because I could feel how easily they'd be turned against me. Any protest would sound defensive. Emotional. Unstable. Keenan finally looked up. For half a second, our eyes met. Then he looked away again. That moment landed harder than the rest. It told me this wasn't just her story anymore. He'd accepted it, or at least allowed it to stand. Someone suggested moving on. Another person stood up to refill drinks. The music came back on, a little louder than before, as if noise could erase what had already happened. Tiana placed the gift aside, out of reach. And just like that, the evening continued. But I didn't. I sat there, smiling when expected, nodding when spoken to, knowing something had shifted permanently. Not just the heirloom. My position in my own family had just been quietly revoked. Later that night, after the plates were cleared and people began drifting into smaller conversations, Tiana acted like nothing had happened. She moved easily through the room, laughing, pouring drinks, telling stories. Every so often, she'd glance toward the corner where she'd placed the gift, checking on it the way someone checks on their purse. At one point, she stood near the hallway and started talking about the house. Not admiring it. Assessing it. She mentioned the furniture first. How solid it was. How well it had held up. Then the artwork. Then the idea of downsizing, said casually, like it was an obvious next step. She spoke in general terms, but her eyes kept landing on me, waiting to see if I'd object. I didn't. She talked about accounts too. Not specifics. Just enough to signal familiarity. Enough to suggest she knew more than she should. Someone asked a question, trying to clarify, and she answered smoothly, confidently, as if she were the authority. No one corrected her. Keenan stayed close to her, nodding when she spoke. When someone asked him directly, he hesitated, then echoed her words almost exactly. It sounded rehearsed. I realized then that this hadn't started tonight. The confidence. The certainty. The way she spoke about my things as if they were already transitioning into someone else's hands. This was just the first time she'd done it out loud. In front of witnesses. I excused myself and stepped into the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter until my hands steadied. My reflection in the dark window startled me. I looked smaller somehow. Older. But not confused. That mattered. When I returned to the living room, nothing had changed. The party rolled on. The narrative had been set. And for the first time, I understood that silence wasn't just something happening around me. It was being used against me. After the last guests left and the house finally went quiet, I found Keenan in the hallway, slipping on his coat. The tree lights were still on. Wrapping paper lay scattered across the floor like evidence no one wanted to collect. The gift was gone. I asked him, calmly, where it had been taken. He sighed before answering, like I'd exhausted him just by asking. He said Tiana thought it would be better to keep it safe. That there had been conversations. That I shouldn't worry. I told him there hadn't been any conversations. Not with me. He shifted his weight and rubbed his face, avoiding my eyes. He said I might not remember everything the same way anymore. That stress could do that to people. That Tiana was only trying to make sure things didn't get complicated later. Later again. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not panic. Not anger. Clarity. I asked him directly if he believed I'd promised her my belongings. If he believed I'd agreed to give up control of my home, my things, my choices. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no either. He said he didn't want conflict. He said it was hard being in the middle. He said things would calm down if I just let it go. That was the moment I understood what had really been taken from me that night. Not just an heirloom. My credibility. I told him I hadn't given permission for anything. That taking something from me without my consent was wrong. He nodded, distracted, already halfway out the door. When it closed behind him, the house felt different. Not empty. Occupied by a story that wasn't mine. And I knew then that if I didn't correct it soon, it would harden into fact. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table long after the house went dark, the only light coming from the small lamp over the sink. Every sound felt louder than it should have. The hum of the refrigerator. The tick of the clock. Proof that time was still moving, even if my place in it felt suddenly uncertain. I replayed the evening from the beginning, searching for the moment I could have stopped it. A firmer tone. A louder objection. A refusal to let the box leave the room. But every version ended the same way. She had spoken with certainty. And certainty convinces people faster than truth. I realized then how carefully the ground had been prepared. The questions. The comments about concern. The way my hesitation had been framed as weakness. This wasn't impulsive. It was procedural. Step by step, designed to look responsible. I stood and walked through the house slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the door frames, the things that anchored me. This was my life. My history. My authority. And it had been challenged in public. By morning, the shock had burned off, leaving something steadier behind. I wasn't confused. I wasn't declining. And I wasn't powerless. They had assumed silence meant consent. They were wrong. I knew then that I wouldn't argue in living rooms or defend myself at dinner tables. I wouldn't try to win back sympathy or explain myself into credibility. There were records. Documents. Decisions already made that they didn't know about. And I would let those speak. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs, not to sleep, but to prepare. Because whatever they thought they'd taken from me on Christmas Eve, they had misunderstood one thing completely. I was still in control. The morning after Christmas, I stopped replaying the night and started writing things down. Not accusations. Not emotions. Facts. I listed what had been said. Who was in the room. Where the gift had been placed. When it left the house. I wrote until the memories settled into order instead of circling my thoughts. It felt less like reliving and more like reclaiming. By midday, my phone rang. It was Keenan. He didn't ask how I was. He said Tiana was worried. That I'd seemed confused the night before. That maybe we should talk about getting things organized before things got harder. I asked him to explain what he meant by harder. He hesitated, then mentioned paperwork. Future planning. Making sure everyone was protected. Everyone but me, apparently. I told him I wasn't making decisions over the phone. That if there were concerns, they could be put in writing. There was a pause. Then he said that might not be necessary. That told me everything. After the call, I opened the file cabinet in the hallway. I hadn't touched it in years, not because I'd forgotten it existed, but because I'd never needed to. I pulled out folders labeled in Solomon's handwriting. Insurance. Property. Trust. My hands slowed when I reached the one marked amendments. Inside were documents I remembered signing years earlier, after Solomon got sick. Practical conversations. Quiet decisions. Protections we'd put in place because we trusted time less than clarity. I didn't read everything yet. I didn't need to. Just seeing that folder reminded me of something important. This wasn't about convincing anyone. It was about enforcing what already existed. That afternoon, I went to the bank. Not to accuse. Not to confront. Just to ask a question and listen carefully to the answer. The branch was busy, the kind of slow, polite busy where no one is in a rush to finish anything. I waited in line, hands folded, reminding myself to stay calm. This wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a procedural one. When it was my turn, I explained that I wanted to review recent account activity and confirm who had access. The bank clerk nodded, typing steadily, asking for identification. Then she paused. She said some requests had already been made. Not withdrawals. Inquiries. About consolidation. About future authority. She spoke neutrally, but the words landed heavy. I asked who made them. She said she couldn't share that without additional authorization. That certain notes were internal. That it would take time. Time was the first obstacle. I thanked her and left without pushing. Arguing wouldn't help. Records would. In the car, I sat for a few minutes before starting the engine. The clarity from earlier sharpened into focus. This wasn't paranoia. Someone had been laying groundwork. When I got home, there was a message from Keenan. He said Tiana had been just checking things because she cared. That I shouldn't read into it. I didn't respond. Instead, I wrote down the bank visit. The phrasing. The hesitation. The boundaries. Friction had entered the process. That was expected. But friction also meant there was a trail. And trails, given enough patience, always lead somewhere. I met with an attorney 2 days later. I didn't walk in angry. I walked in prepared. I brought my notes, the folder from the cabinet, and a quiet determination not to be rushed. The attorney listened more than he spoke. He asked when Solomon and I had created the trust. Who had been present? Whether there had been any recent changes or attempts to access it. When I mentioned the Christmas Eve incident, he didn't react emotionally. He asked who witnessed it. That question mattered more than sympathy. I told him about the bank visit. The inquiries. The suggestion that concerns had already been raised. He nodded slowly. He said it wasn't uncommon for family members to frame control as care. That accusations of decline were often used to justify early intervention. He didn't say it lightly. He said it like someone who'd seen it before. Then he asked a question that made my chest tighten. Had anyone ever asked him about me before? He explained that someone had called his office weeks earlier, asking general questions about conservatorship and trust authority. No names. Just hypotheticals. Just enough to test the ground. I didn't need to ask who. That was the second obstacle. Proof without a signature. Intent without a document. The attorney told me not to confront anyone yet. He said timing mattered. That once accusations were spoken aloud, they took on a life of their own. Instead, he advised documentation. Formal requests. Controlled steps. I left the office lighter than I'd arrived. Not because the situation was smaller, but because I wasn't imagining it. And because the law, when used patiently, still recognized the difference between concern and control. That evening, I finally sat down with the trust documents. Not to skim. To read. I spread them across the dining table, the same table where Christmas dinner had unraveled days earlier. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Chaos on one side of the week. Order on the other. The trust itself was straightforward. Assets listed. Authority defined. Nothing unusual. But when I reached the amendment section, my breath caught. There it was. An amendment signed years ago, after Solomon's diagnosis, when we'd been forced to think clearly about futures we didn't want to imagine. It wasn't dramatic. Just precise. Ownership did not transfer through marriage. Authority could not be assumed through proximity. Any attempt to claim assets without written consent triggered automatic review and restriction. I read that paragraph 3 times. I remembered the conversation then. Solomon had been calm. Practical. He said love didn't need shortcuts, and protection didn't mean distrust. It meant clarity. The amendment named me explicitly as the sole decision-maker unless I voluntarily appointed someone else. No one else could step in. Not a spouse. Not a child. Not someone claiming concern. I felt something shift as I read. Not relief. Alignment. Everything that had felt aggressive suddenly looked reckless. Everything that had felt confident now looked uninformed. But there was still a problem. The amendment was valid, but quiet. It protected me legally, not socially. It didn't stop people from believing a lie. It just made acting on that lie dangerous. That mattered. I closed the folder and sat back, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't about surprising anyone. It was about choosing when the truth would be revealed. And making sure it happened where silence couldn't bury it. Knowing the amendment existed didn't mean I could use it yet. That was the hard part. The attorney explained it plainly when I called him the next morning. The amendment was enforceable, but copies had to be certified. Notices had to be issued properly. If I rushed it, it would look reactive. Emotional. Exactly the story they were already hinting at. Procedure takes time. I requested certified copies through the trustee's office and was told it could take up to 2 weeks. Holidays slowed everything down. Offices ran on skeleton schedules. Messages went unanswered. Waiting became the third obstacle. During that time, Tiana didn't slow down. She sent a message asking if I'd thought more about making things easier. She suggested we meet to talk things through. She used careful language, like someone documenting reasonableness for later reference. I didn't respond. Instead, I kept records. Screenshots. Dates. Times. Phrasing. Keenan stopped calling altogether. The silence felt deliberate now, not accidental. A pause meant to apply pressure without leaving fingerprints. One afternoon, I found a note taped inside my mailbox from a neighbor, asking if everything was okay. They'd seen unfamiliar cars parked near my house during the day. People coming and going while I wasn't home. That tightened something in my chest. I checked my security camera history. Not to accuse. To confirm. There were brief visits. No break-ins. Just presence. Just enough to feel invasive without being illegal. Everything stayed just shy of crossing a line. That's when I understood the strategy. If I reacted too soon, I'd look unstable. If I waited, they'd assume I wouldn't react at all. So I waited. But not passively. I waited with documentation, witnesses, and the law moving quietly in the background, exactly where it belonged. The first person to say something out loud wasn't family. It was a neighbor. She stopped me one morning while I was bringing in groceries. She hesitated before speaking, like she wasn't sure if it was her place. Then she said she'd seen Tiana inside my house weeks earlier, walking through rooms with a notebook. Not visiting. Not chatting. Measuring. She said she'd assumed I knew. That it had seemed official. Like arrangements were already in motion. I thanked her and asked when it happened. She told me the date without guessing. She remembered because it was the same day a delivery truck blocked her driveway. That detail mattered. I asked if anyone else had been there. She nodded. Keenan. Quiet. Hanging back. Letting Tiana talk. She apologized for not saying something sooner. She said she didn't want to offend me. I told her she hadn't. I told her she'd helped me. Later that day, I checked my calendar. I hadn't been home that afternoon. I'd been at a doctor's appointment. Routine. Documented. The timing lined up too cleanly to ignore. I wrote it down. Not emotionally. Precisely. Name. Date. Time. Observation. This was different from suspicion. This was corroboration. Still, it wasn't enough on its own. One witness could be dismissed as confused or mistaken. Especially when the narrative already framed me that way. But witnesses had a way of multiplying once someone spoke first. That evening, I reviewed the security footage again. Not just for cars. For patterns. For gaps. For repetition. The story they were building had structure. So would mine. And unlike theirs, mine wouldn't rely on implication. It would rely on records, timelines, and people who had no reason to lie. That night, doubt tried one last time to make itself comfortable. It crept in quietly, the way it always does, asking reasonable-sounding questions. What if I was overreacting? What if this was just concern that had gone too far? What if pushing back made things worse? I sat with those thoughts instead of fighting them. Then I opened my notebook. I read the entries from the beginning. The dates. The repeated language. The way certain phrases kept appearing in different mouths, slightly reworded but carrying the same intent. Easier. Later. Handled. Words that erased consent while pretending to protect. Fear thrives in isolation. Patterns dissolve it. I realized something then. I wasn't reacting to one incident. I was responding to a sequence. A plan that counted on me doubting myself long enough for it to finish unfolding. That clarity felt like stepping into cold air. The next morning, when Tiana called, I answered. She sounded surprised. Then relieved. She said she was glad I was feeling better. She suggested lunch. Neutral ground. A chance to clear the air. I told her that wouldn't be necessary. That if there were concerns, they could go through my attorney. There was a pause on the line. Just long enough to matter. She asked if I thought that was wise. I said it was appropriate. When I hung up, my hands were steady. That was the shift. Not revenge. Not confrontation. Just the moment I stopped explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. From that point on, every step I took had purpose. And every word I didn't say became leverage. 2 days later, the escalation came. Not loud. Not dramatic. Official. I received a call from a social services office asking to confirm basic information. Living situation. Support system. Daily routines. The questions were framed as routine, but the timing wasn't. Someone had raised concerns. That's when I understood, this wasn't concern. It was a narrative being filed. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I asked for the name of the caseworker and the nature of the inquiry. She hesitated, then said it was a wellness check prompted by a third party. Concern, again. After the call, I sat quietly for a moment, letting the shape of it settle. This was the move they'd been circling. Not a grab. A justification. If authority could be questioned, control could follow. I called my attorney immediately. He wasn't surprised. He told me this was common once informal pressure failed. He said the key was cooperation without concession. That afternoon, the caseworker arrived. She was polite. Professional. She asked to come in. I let her. I answered questions calmly. I showed her my calendar, my medication list, my home. I didn't volunteer explanations. I let normalcy speak for itself. Before she left, she said something that stayed with me. She said the report didn't match what she was seeing. That was the moment the balance shifted. They had escalated too soon. Because now, there was an official record. Not of decline. But of stability. When the door closed behind her, I didn't feel shaken. I felt ready. The narrative they'd been building had finally entered the open. And once a story is written down by the wrong witness, it stops belonging to the people who invented it. The next step wasn't reactive. It was administrative. My attorney filed a formal notice invoking the trust amendment. No accusations. No commentary. Just a statement of authority and a request for acknowledgement. The language was neutral, almost bland, but its effect was anything but. Copies went to the trustee, the bank, and, by requirement, to Keenan. Not to Tiana. That omission was intentional. Within hours, the bank called to confirm receipt. Access flags were updated. Any inquiries now required my direct authorization. Notes were added to the account file, the kind that don't announce themselves but change how every future request is handled. I asked for written confirmation. I received it. Later that day, Keenan texted. A single sentence asking what was going on. I didn't respond immediately. I forwarded the message to my attorney instead. Let him advise the reply. When it came, it was simple. Factual. Detached. I was exercising existing authority. There was nothing to undo. The silence that followed felt different than before. Less heavy. More controlled. That evening, I reviewed the trust again, this time with the calm of someone standing on firm ground. Every clause had weight now. Every delay had purpose. They had tried to frame me as uncertain. In response, I'd created a paper trail that made certainty unavoidable. I didn't need to explain myself to family. I didn't need to persuade anyone. Systems respond to documentation, not emotion. And once a system is engaged, it doesn't care who feels offended. It only cares who has the right to decide. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I slept without replaying conversations in my head. Not because things were resolved, but because they were finally moving in the right direction. The response didn't come as outrage. It came as delay. Days passed without confrontation. No calls. No messages. Just a careful quiet that felt calculated. The kind of silence people use when they're reassessing a plan that didn't work the way they expected. Then the bank called again. This time, the clerk sounded more formal. She explained that additional inquiries had been attempted after the notice went out. Requests for clarification. Questions about authority. All of them stopped at the same barrier. Mine. She didn't say who made them. She didn't need to. I thanked her and asked her to note the timing. She said it already had been. That was the friction working in my favor now. Later that afternoon, my attorney called. He said the trustee's office was taking longer than usual to issue the final certified acknowledgement. Not because of a problem. Because of volume. End of year backlog. Holidays again. More waiting. But waiting now had a different shape. It wasn't exposure. It was containment. Keenan finally called that evening. He sounded frustrated, not angry. He said Tiana felt shut out. That she was worried I was being influenced by outside voices. I asked him if he meant my attorney. He didn't answer directly. I told him I wasn't making changes under pressure. That if there were concerns, they should be raised formally. In writing. Through the proper channels. He exhaled sharply and said this was becoming complicated. I told him it already was. I just wasn't pretending otherwise anymore. When the call ended, I realized something important. They were no longer acting like people managing a transition. They were acting like people who'd lost access. And loss, even temporary, tends to expose intentions people work very hard to keep hidden. Keenan came by the house the next day alone. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, like he wasn't sure what kind of reception to expect. His posture was tense. Defensive. Not hostile, but prepared. He didn't sit right away. He paced, hands in his pockets, then finally stopped across from me and asked why I was doing all this. I asked him what he thought this was. He said it felt like I was shutting them out. That I'd changed suddenly. That involving lawyers made everything feel extreme. I told him nothing I'd done was new. The documents existed before Christmas. The authority existed before Tiana spoke for me. I was just using it now. He said Tiana believed I'd promised her the jewelry years ago. That I'd wanted her to have it eventually. I told him eventually wasn't the same as already. And belief wasn't the same as consent. He rubbed his face and said she was scared. That she thought I didn't trust her. I asked him when trust started meaning access. That stopped him. He looked at the floor again, the same way he had on Christmas Eve. The silence stretched. Familiar now. I told him I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't testing loyalty. I was correcting a false narrative before it hardened into something irreversible. He asked what would happen next. I told him that depended on choices he and Tiana made, not on how loudly they objected. When he left, he didn't slam the door. But he didn't apologize either. And that told me everything I needed to know about where he was still standing. After Keenan left, I didn't rush to clean up the house. I let the quiet sit where it landed. There was a time when I would have replayed every word, searching for the sentence that might have softened things. The one that could have pulled him back toward me. But that instinct felt distant now, like a habit I'd already outgrown. Instead, I opened my laptop and organized what I had. Screenshots in one folder. Notes in another. Dates cross-checked against calendars and call logs. I wasn't building a story. I was aligning a timeline. Each entry made the next one clearer. Midway through, my phone buzzed. A message from Tiana. She said she was confused. That she didn't understand why things had escalated. That she only wanted to help and felt shut out. The tone was calm. Reasonable. Almost kind. I didn't respond. I forwarded it to my attorney and added it to the file. The phrasing mattered. The timing mattered more. An hour later, another message came in. This one less polished. She said she hoped I wasn't being manipulated. That stress could affect judgment. That she was worried about me. Concern, again. I closed the message without answering. That was the moment I understood something clearly. Responding would give her what she wanted, dialogue she could shape, words she could reinterpret. Silence, used correctly, creates boundaries no argument ever could. That evening, I reviewed the trust language one more time. Not because I doubted it, but because repetition builds confidence. Every clause still said the same thing. Authority stayed with me. No explanation required. I turned off the laptop and sat back, feeling a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. They were still trying to negotiate. I was already executing. And the difference between those two positions was about to become very visible. The invitation came from Tiana 2 days later. She framed it as a reset. A small family gathering. No tension. No agendas. Just a chance to clear the air before things went any further. She suggested Sunday afternoon. Lunch. Neutral. Public enough to feel safe. Private enough to control the room. I recognized the move immediately. This wasn't reconciliation. It was positioning. If I declined, it could be framed as avoidance. If I attended without preparation, it could be reframed later as agreement. Words spoken casually have a way of becoming commitments when repeated by the wrong person. I didn't answer right away. I called my attorney instead. He said I could attend if I wanted, but only if the terms were clear. No negotiations. No decisions. And witnesses who weren't invested in rewriting the outcome. That mattered. I responded to Tiana with a short message. I said I'd attend, but only with extended family present. No private discussions. No surprises. There was a delay before she replied. When she did, she said that seemed unnecessary. That this was between us. That involving others would only complicate things. I told her clarity rarely complicated anything. She agreed to the gathering, but the tone shifted. The friendliness drained away, replaced by something sharper. Controlled, but strained. That told me everything I needed to know. I began preparing quietly. Not speeches. Not arguments. Documents. Copies. Timelines. I didn't plan to confront anyone. I planned to let facts exist in the room. Because public settings don't just expose lies. They limit how far people are willing to defend them. And if she wanted witnesses so badly on Christmas Eve, I was more than willing to provide them again, this time, on my terms. The certified acknowledgement arrived the morning of the gathering. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the kitchen counter while I made coffee, while the house settled into its usual sounds. The envelope wasn't dramatic. Plain. Official. Heavy in the way paperwork becomes when it carries authority. When I finally opened it, the language was exactly what my attorney had described. The trust amendment was active. Recognized. Enforceable. Any attempt to bypass it would trigger formal review and potential sanctions. No ambiguity. I scanned the signatures, the dates, the stamps. Everything was in order. I made copies. 3 of them. I placed the original back in the envelope and slid it into my folder, along with the bank confirmations and my notes. Not to brandish. Just to have. Before leaving, I paused in the living room and looked at the space where Christmas Eve had unfolded. The tree was gone now. The room felt neutral again. Empty in a clean way. I thought about how confident Tiana had sounded that night. How sure she'd been that the future was already decided. Confidence built on assumption rarely survives contact with documentation. At the gathering, people arrived slowly. Familiar faces. Neutral expressions. No one knew exactly why they'd been invited, only that something was off. Tiana greeted me politely. Carefully. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Keenan hovered nearby, visibly tense. We sat down. Small talk filled the space. The kind that pretends nothing is wrong. I didn't rush. Because timing, once again, mattered. And this time, I knew exactly when the truth would enter the room. The moment came without an announcement. Someone asked an innocent question about the holidays. Another person laughed, trying to ease the tension. Tiana leaned forward, took the opening, and spoke about the future. She used careful language. Inclusive language. She said things were being handled. That plans were in motion. That it was a relief knowing responsibilities would be shared going forward. I let her finish. Then I reached into my folder and placed a single document on the table. Not sliding it toward her. Just setting it down where everyone could see it existed. I said I wanted to clarify something before assumptions went any further. The room stilled in a way that felt familiar now. I explained, calmly, that there was an active trust amendment. That authority over my property, finances, and personal decisions remained solely with me. That no one had permission to act on my behalf unless I gave it in writing. No accusations. No raised voice. Just facts. Tiana's expression shifted, not to anger, but calculation. She said she didn't know anything about an amendment. That she'd only been acting based on what she'd been told. I said that was the problem. I pointed out, gently, that inquiries had been made. That visits had occurred when I wasn't home. That claims had been spoken publicly. I didn't name motives. I named timelines. My cousin asked a question. Then another. Clarifications piled up, not from me, but from the room. Keenan went quiet, his face draining of color. Tiana tried to redirect, to frame it as concern again. But concern doesn't explain inventory. It doesn't explain authority claimed out loud. The narrative she'd been carrying cracked, not because I challenged it, but because it couldn't hold weight under scrutiny. For the first time, she wasn't controlling the room. She was surviving it. And everyone could see the difference. The room didn't explode after that. It recalibrated. People shifted in their seats. Someone folded their arms. Someone else leaned back, suddenly observant instead of polite. The energy changed from participation to evaluation, and Tiana felt it immediately. She spoke again, slower this time. She said she'd only stepped in because she thought I needed help. That everything she'd done was out of love and responsibility. She said misunderstandings happen in families. No one interrupted her. That was worse. Because silence, when it comes after facts, doesn't protect you. It measures you. I didn't respond right away. I let the quiet do its work. Then I said one thing. I said that help doesn't start with taking. That responsibility doesn't require secrecy. And that love doesn't need permission it was never given. I gathered my folder and stood. I told everyone that nothing more needed to be discussed publicly. That the legal framework was clear. That any future questions could be addressed properly, through the appropriate channels. I didn't look at Tiana when I said it. I didn't need to. Keenan finally spoke. He asked if we could talk later. Not now. I said maybe. I said we'd see. That answer landed differently than I expected. Not as rejection. As boundary. As I walked out, no one followed me. That told me the room understood what had just happened. This wasn't a confrontation that ended in shouting. It was the moment authority changed hands without force. The story Tiana had been telling didn't just lose credibility. It lost its audience. And as I drove home, I knew it wouldn't be about proving anything. It would be about consequences unfolding where witnesses could no longer look away. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. Phone calls not returned. Invitations quietly withdrawn. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The kind of social shift that doesn't announce itself, but changes everything. People had questions now. Not for me, for each other. I heard about it secondhand. A cousin asking why Tiana had spoken with such authority. An aunt wondering how long the planning had really been going on. A neighbor mentioning the cars again, this time with a raised eyebrow instead of concern. Nothing I'd said at the gathering had spread fast. What spread was doubt. That was enough. A few days later, Keenan called. His voice sounded tired, stripped of defensiveness. He said people were talking. He said Tiana felt judged. That she didn't understand how things had turned so quickly. I told him things don't turn quickly when they've been leaning for a long time. He asked if I'd meant for it to become public. I said I'd meant for it to become accurate. There was a long pause. He said he needed time. I told him I understood. And I meant it. Later that evening, I received a message from someone who'd been at the gathering. They thanked me. Not for explaining, but for stopping something they hadn't known how to question. That message mattered more than I expected. Because it confirmed what I already knew. I hadn't humiliated anyone deliberately. I'd removed cover. And once cover is gone, people don't need persuasion. They see what's been there all along. It wasn't going to be about confrontation. It was going to be about what happens when a story can no longer survive daylight. The next gathering wasn't planned as a reckoning. It was my cousin's birthday. Loud, crowded, casual. The kind of event where people talk in overlapping conversations and no one expects anything serious to happen. That's why it worked. I arrived early, not to prepare, but to observe. Tiana was already there, moving through the room with practiced ease, smiling a little too carefully. She spoke in shorter sentences now. Less certainty. More checking faces as she talked. When someone asked her about the jewelry, she laughed it off. Said it was a misunderstanding. That things had gotten blown out of proportion. I didn't respond. Someone else did. They asked why, if it was a misunderstanding, she'd taken the box out of my hands in front of everyone. They didn't sound angry. Just curious. The room quieted in the way rooms do when curiosity replaces politeness. Tiana smiled again, tighter this time. She said she'd been trying to help. That I'd been overwhelmed. That sometimes people forget conversations. The word forget hung in the air. I didn't correct her. I reached into my bag and placed the certified acknowledgement on the counter beside the cake. Not opening it. Just setting it down. I said, calmly, that misunderstandings don't require paperwork. Authority does. Someone asked what it was. I told them it was proof that no promises had been made, and no authority had been granted. No speeches. No accusations. Just presence. Tiana went quiet. Not stunned. Calculating. But calculation doesn't work when the room has already decided to listen differently. The music came back on eventually. Conversations resumed. But something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't leading anymore. She was being watched. The reactions came in layers. Not gasps or raised voices. Just subtle recalibrations. People leaned toward each other instead of toward Tiana. Conversations adjusted course. Names were mentioned more carefully. Jokes landed softer. A few people approached me quietly. One asked if I was okay. Another said they hadn't known how uncomfortable Christmas Eve had felt until they saw it clearly now. No one apologized outright. They didn't need to. Their tone said enough. Tiana stayed near the kitchen, busying herself with small tasks that didn't need doing. Rearranging plates. Wiping a counter that was already clean. She laughed when spoken to, but the laughter came too late, like a delayed echo. Keenan stood off to the side, watching. He didn't join her. He didn't join me either. He looked like someone realizing the ground under him wasn't where he thought it was. At one point, someone asked him a direct question. Not about the trust. About why he hadn't spoken up that night. He hesitated. That hesitation did more damage than any document ever could. He said he hadn't wanted to cause a scene. That he thought it would resolve itself. The explanation landed flat. No one argued with him. They didn't have to. Silence, again. But this time, it wasn't protecting anyone. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. As I left, I caught Tiana's eye. Just for a moment. There was no anger there. No plea. Only the awareness that the room no longer belonged to her. Public humiliation doesn't always arrive as spectacle. Sometimes it arrives as loss of influence. And once that's gone, there's nothing left to hold on to. After that, the explanations started. Not to me. Around me. I heard later how Tiana had tried to reframe things in smaller conversations. She said she'd misunderstood. That she'd moved too fast out of concern. That she never meant to overstep. Each version softened the edges but kept the center intact. Responsibility diluted. Intent excused. What didn't change was the timeline. People compared notes now. Dates. Who'd been present. What had been said and when. Once that starts, stories stop floating. They land. A friend called me that evening and asked something simple. She asked why Tiana had spoken with such confidence if nothing had been decided. Later, I learned where the first version of that concern had come from. It wasn't official. It was casual. A conversation. Rashida Hartwell's son, someone Tiana spoke with regularly, had mentioned, offhandedly, that I seemed overwhelmed lately. She said it like an observation, not an accusation. But once a sentence like that leaves someone's mouth, it doesn't stay where it started. I didn't answer with theory. I answered with fact. I said authority had been assumed before it was granted. That sentence traveled. Keenan came by again 2 days later. He didn't defend her this time. He didn't accuse me either. He said things had gotten complicated at home. That Tiana felt embarrassed. I told him embarrassment was different from harm. He asked if I could have handled it privately. I asked him how long he'd known about the concerns being raised. He didn't answer. That was answer enough. The last thing he said before leaving was that he didn't recognize his family anymore. I told him families change when lies are removed. They don't always change in ways people expect. When the door closed, I felt something release in my chest. Not satisfaction. Finality. Because whatever version of peace had existed before was built on my silence. And silence, once broken, doesn't come back the same way. Nor should it. The call from the social services office came a week later. This time, it wasn't a question. It was a closure. The caseworker said the inquiry had been resolved. No further action required. The report noted no concerns regarding my independence or decision-making capacity. I thanked her and asked if that would be documented. She said it already was. That mattered more than she probably realized. Because what had begun as a whisper campaign now had an official ending. Not dramatic. Just final. I forwarded the confirmation to my attorney. He replied with a single sentence, "Good." That closes the loop. After that, the narrative had nowhere left to go. Tiana didn't call again. She didn't message. She didn't attempt another meeting. The silence felt different this time. Not strategic. Exhausted. Keenan sent a short text a few days later. He said he was sorry things had gotten out of hand. He didn't say sorry for his silence. He didn't say sorry for believing her. I didn't push him to say more. Some realizations need space to land. That evening, I took the cedar box out again. I opened it slowly, not with hesitation this time, but with steadiness. The jewelry looked the same as it always had. Untouched. Unclaimed. I closed the lid and placed the box back in the dresser. Not as a gesture of withholding. As a reminder. The power to decide had survived every attempt to strip it away. And now, even institutions had confirmed it. That kind of validation doesn't feel loud. It feels like gravity settling back where it belongs. The final shift happened quietly. It came in the form of an email forwarded by my attorney. The bank confirmed that all prior inquiry notes had been closed. Any flags raised before Christmas were officially marked as unfounded. The language was dry. Administrative. But its meaning was unmistakable. Whatever story had been told behind my back had reached its end. Around the same time, I noticed something else. Invitations I hadn't received in weeks started arriving again. Small ones. Casual ones. Coffee. Lunch. Nothing dramatic. Just a return to normal contact, offered carefully, like people weren't sure how much distance I still wanted. That was the real consequence. Not legal defeat. Social recalibration. Tiana wasn't mentioned by name anymore. When she came up, it was indirect. That situation. What happened over the holidays? People lowered their voices instinctively, as if speaking too confidently now felt risky. I ran into her once at the grocery store. She looked thinner. Quieter. She nodded politely and kept walking. No smile. No confrontation. Just retreat. Public humiliation doesn't always look like embarrassment. Sometimes it looks like invisibility. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. Finished proving. Finished correcting. Finished holding space for someone else's version of me. That evening, I sat in my living room with the lights off, watching the city glow outside the windows. Atlanta moved on, indifferent and steady. So did I. Because once truth has been witnessed widely enough, it no longer needs defense. It holds. And all that's left after that is deciding how much access anyone deserves going forward. That decision, at least, was finally mine alone. The boundary didn't need a speech. It took shape through absence. I stopped initiating contact. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. If someone wanted access to me now, they would have to approach without assumptions, without urgency, without speaking for me. Weeks passed. Keenan came by once, unannounced. He stood on the porch, hands empty, eyes tired. He didn't ask to come in. He said he just wanted to check on me. I thanked him and stepped outside, closing the door behind me. We talked about ordinary things. Work. The weather. Nothing that mattered, and everything that did. He didn't mention Tiana. I didn't ask. Before he left, he said he missed how things used to be. I told him I missed being trusted. He nodded slowly, like that sentence landed somewhere deeper than he expected. I didn't invite him in. That wasn't punishment. It was pacing. Trust, once damaged, doesn't get restored through nostalgia. Later that day, I changed something small but symbolic. I updated emergency contacts. Removed names that assumed proximity. Added ones that had shown consistency. I informed my attorney. I informed the bank. I documented the shift. No drama. No confrontation. Just alignment. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. Not because everything was repaired, but because nothing was being taken from me anymore. Boundaries don't announce themselves. They settle into place, firm and quiet, and begin doing their work long after people stop noticing them. And for the first time, I felt the house fully recognize me again. As its owner. As its authority. As its keeper. The loss didn't arrive all at once either. It showed up in the quiet spaces I hadn't prepared for. The holidays that followed felt smaller. Quieter. Invitations still came, but fewer included Keenan's voice on the other end. When they did, his tone stayed careful, like he wasn't sure which version of me he was allowed to speak to anymore. I missed him. Not the man he'd become in those months, but the son who used to call just to ask what I was cooking. The one who trusted my judgment without needing confirmation from someone else. That version felt farther away now. I didn't chase it. Because chasing would have meant pretending nothing had changed. And something had. One afternoon, I walked through the house and noticed how many of Solomon's things I'd kept exactly where they were. His chair. His books. His jacket still hanging in the hall. They hadn't felt heavy before. They felt anchored now. This house had held loss before. It had survived it. So had I. The cost of standing my ground wasn't abstract. It was personal. It was the distance that settled between me and my son. The conversations that stayed shallow. The future gatherings that would never feel effortless again. I grieved that quietly. But grief didn't mean regret. Because the alternative would have been worse. A slow erosion. A life lived under someone else's assumptions. As the sun set that evening, the light fell across the living room floor in the same pattern it always had. Familiar. Unchanged. Some things, I realized, don't need to be protected loudly. They just need to be protected at all. And I had finally done that, even if it cost me something I loved. Spring arrived without asking my permission. The trees outside the house filled in slowly, the way they always did, reminding me that time doesn't pause just because something breaks. I started opening the windows again. Letting air move through rooms that had felt sealed off for too long. I reorganized the bedroom dresser one afternoon, not out of necessity, but intention. I took the cedar box out and cleaned it carefully, polishing the wood, replacing the lining. The jewelry stayed inside, untouched, but the act itself felt deliberate. This wasn't about guarding something. It was about choosing. I thought about who Solomon had been when he trusted me with that responsibility. Not fearful. Not suspicious. Just clear-eyed. He believed authority should rest with the person willing to carry it quietly. I realized then that I didn't owe the future to anyone simply because they expected it. Legacy isn't entitlement. It's alignment. Keenan sent a message that week. Nothing heavy. Just a photo of something ordinary, a memory he knew I'd recognize. No commentary. No demands. I replied with a heart emoji and nothing else. That felt right. Not a reconciliation. Not a rejection. A pause with space to breathe. I spent more time with people who listened without steering. Who asked instead of assumed. The house filled again, not with noise, but with presence. One evening, I sat on the porch as the light faded, the city humming softly in the distance. Atlanta felt steady. Familiar. A place that had witnessed the worst of the rupture and the quiet strength that followed. I hadn't regained everything I lost. But I had reclaimed something more durable. The right to decide my life without explanation. And that, I knew, would carry me forward far longer than any heirloom ever could. On the next Christmas Eve, I didn't host. I stayed home. I cooked a small meal, I lit a candle near the window. I let the night pass without performance or expectation. No gifts arranged to prove generosity. No audience waiting to measure my role. The house was quiet, but not empty. I took the cedar box out one last time and set it on the table. I opened it, looked at the jewelry, and closed it again. Not because I was afraid to let go. Because I understood something I hadn't before. The power wasn't in passing things down. It was in knowing when not to. What had been taken from me that first Christmas Eve wasn't the heirloom. It was the assumption that I needed permission to exist in my own life. That my authority could be overridden if someone spoke confidently enough in front of witnesses. That assumption didn't survive. It collapsed under records, restraint, and the simple refusal to disappear. I thought about Keenan. About what might still be repaired one day, and what might not. I didn't rush either thought. Some things heal slowly. Others just change shape. I turned off the lights and stood by the window, watching the city glow. Atlanta moved forward, unaware of my small victory. And that was fine. Justice doesn't always need applause. Sometimes it looks like a door closing softly behind you. I didn't win back my old family. I claimed something better. My name. My choices. My life untouched, intact, and finally unquestioned. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.